You're listening to Taking Care of Business with Marty Pay and Clay Kerner on Kern Radio Newstalk 1180.
Show me the money!
I think our engineer back there, Goose, is having too much fun with this. Welcome back to Taking Care of Business. Our guest by phone is Tobin Smith from Bulls and Bears.
That's the Obama stash.
Let's see. I wanted to talk a little bit more about Mr. Bernanke.
Sure.
I couldn't believe this. He said 8% employment for over 2 years. I mean, it sounds like a jobless recovery, but can we live with 8% unemployment for the next couple of years? I mean, how are we going to be able to increase the economy with that kind of unemployment?
Yeah, well, he is a historian, if nothing else. And if you look at some of the major economic work that's been done in a post-financial crisis-led recession, it takes many years. I mean, the last one really was Sweden, where you have a hard time drawing a parallel between the Swedish economy and the United States economy. But in all countries where you've had these financial-led recessions, it takes such a long time for the bad stuff to get unwound, and really just takes time. And so because of that, you don't have the velocity. It's a strange concept in economics, but the idea of the turnover of money, how it turns over in our system. I'll give you an example. The fastest growing economy we've ever had, we would have 10 to 11 times turnover. If you had a $14 trillion economy, that means you have about a $1.4 trillion currency and the amount of cash that turns over an economy. That is velocity, and that's what grows economies. When we hit August 2008 and coming into when Lehman Brothers closed, the economy closed down to about a 4 times turnover rate. I mean, that's what really scared the bejesus out of them, and that's why, whether you agree with TARP or not, we had serious problems. I interviewed a number of senators who were in that meeting on September 18th when they called him into a room up the hill, and Paulson got up with Bernanke and said, let me tell you exactly what's about to happen. We had this week $780 billion of cash withdrawn from our system. If we do nothing by this time next week, we will have a run on the banks. And whatever anybody tells you about TARP, I've spent a huge amount of time on this, TARP and all activities were about saving the banks. They couldn't say it. You couldn't look in a camera and say, oh, by the way, we're having a run on the banks. But that's exactly what was happening, and that's what they were fighting. So the history shows us that when you're in a post-financial apocalypse type environment, it takes historically, 8 to 10 years to get back to where you were, and and in the best case scenario, 5 to 6 years. Bernanke's just telling us the truth. Maybe we don't want to hear it. Now, if we as a Congress, we as a people, put our heads together and say, wait a minute, 8% is not going to cut it, and therefore we would need to create an environment of incentives in such a way that we would actually stoke the economy and actually do better than that. We could do better than that, but in the next 2 years, because of the way Congress is set up here, it wouldn't be 2012 until we could do something like it would really get the economy going, like a flat 15% tax, 20% tax on corporations, flat, no mumbo jumbo, flat. Number 2, a capital gains holiday for the next 24, 36 months for new money put to work in the system. If we did those two things, our numbers show we'd probably have about a 5.5% unemployment rate, and we'd have so much revenue coming into the economy and through the taxation system because of the growth that we would, in fact, do a very large part in paying down and stopping the economic or the borrowing side.
I think Canada's dropping their.
We unfortunately elected people at a time where we need economic skills, and we hired people who are community organizers. Sure.
Oh, I like that. Canada's dropping down their corporate rate to 15% this year, aren't they?
Yeah, they're only at an 18% rate, and let's not kid ourselves. The actual corporate tax rate overall, the actual taxes paid in the United States is about 25%. Mm-hmm. Our 35% rule is there's a variety of reasons why companies pay that less rate. But they do that because of a variety. And look at Google, for instance. Google has a subsidiary in Ireland. That's a 15% tax rate. That's where my family comes from, in Ireland, so I can talk this way if I want to. They run all of their European business through that Irish subsidiary, and because of that, they pay very little taxes in Europe on billions and billions of income. Well, there's no way in the world our tax system should allow that to happen. It does, so they're taking advantage of it, and God bless them. If I'm a shareholder of Google, I want them to pay little tax as possible to make the highest profit margin.
Sure.
But we've set up this system, and again, most of all the problems we have in the United States, don't get me started, basically go back to the fact that we have a 21st century economy, and most of the ways that we measure it and run it are like we're an agrarian economy. And because of that, economies and governments always, change slower than the rate of change in the actual economy. But the rate of change, with the internet and everything else, came faster, and we're still counting bales of hay, for God's sakes. Right. In the CPI, we still, up until last year, you couldn't, if you had software and you paid, $10 million for a software system, they assumed that you expensed that all in 1 year, that that software was going to be worth nothing in the second year. Mm-hmm. Why? Because when they made those rules, software changed every 6 months because you were writing it in COBOL, for God's sakes. So we, sure. We have raced ahead of our ways that we count, the way we run. And we're a global economy now, and we still think that we're, growing pistachios in Bakersfield. Not that that's not a good thing to do.
Right. Our guest by phone is Tobin Smith on Taking Care of Business. Toby, just to shift gears a little bit,
sure.
You made a comment the other day that kind of stuck with me. You said the deficit crisis begins when China stops buying our bonds. Do you see that happening? Do you see, because from everything I can see, yeah. China's starting to, not necessarily shrink, but they're starting to put the brakes on a little bit, only because they're looking at what's going on around them. Do you think there's a possibility of that happening?
Well, it's really not. I mean, I hate to be so glib that way because, but here's the facts. When we had like 5,800 missiles pointed at Russia, we sort of had this concept of mutually assured destruction, and that seemed to, in the Cold War, pretty much keep people from doing really stupid things. China, with a trillion of our bonds, but also really that's only that shows up in the books. I'm sure that they own more than that, in other countries because, for instance, the data shows that Great Britain owns about 600 billion of our bonds. Well, if that's the case, then 25% of their reserves are in our bonds. Well, that's not the case. Those are Chinese ownership too, clearly. So if they have $1.5 trillion of our bonds out of the 14 trillion out there, if they quit buying, those bonds will drop 20-30% in value, in a relatively quick period of time. They can't afford that hit. So the idea that they would just stop buying bonds is, they can't do it. It's too big to fail for them. On the other hand, they're clearly, diversifying their reserves, and they're clearly are working at the issue of building their reserves in gold and other, in currencies and so on and so forth. But we're stuck with each other. I do a lot of business in China, and I will tell you that, I sat next to a businessman flying back a couple weeks ago from Shanghai who has a big plant in in North Dakota, and he's got a big plant in China. And he said, Toby, here's the weird thing. When I go to China, they treat me as if I'm a hero. They do everything they can to help me build this business, and I've added, 8,000 jobs in the last 2 years. Mm-hmm. In North Dakota, which is like one of the most, business-worthy and supporting states in our United States. I have every week somebody attacks me, says I'm a bad, evil, greedy, capitalist, and he says, if you compare the treatment I get between China and the United States, there is no comparison. I'm treated like a god in China, and you know what? I'm going to do more business there.
Well, and they're learning from our mistake, basically. So when we come back from the break, we're going to do an update on the congressman's condition and the rest of the story. So we'll be back in a minute with Tobin Smith on Taking Care of Business on Kern Radio Newstalk 1180.